Thursday night Bible studies, we have been doing a survey on the book of Exodus. And we've been going through it pretty quickly. That's what a survey is. We usually take about 5 chapters per night. But if Thursday nights are a survey, Sunday mornings are like this wild whirlwind tour because we seem to be just going through the highlights of the story as we go along. So if you want to know more about the book of Exodus, then I invite you to come to Bible study. And if you still feel like you're being left behind, then I invite you to read the book. Read the source material because it is far from a boring book. It is about how the nation of Israel came into being. And it is about how God became Israel's king instead of Israel's judge. So last week we passed through the Red Sea on the way to the Promised Land with Pharaoh's armies hot on the Israelites' heels. Things didn't end well for Pharaoh's army. So, finally the children of Israel are free from slavery and they are on their way to the land that God promised to their ancestor Abraham. This is a good thing, but they've still got a ways to go. In fact, they've got 40 more years of wandering until they find themselves in this promised land. Now, when you look at the scriptures, you understand that there is a correlation between the wilderness and the number of 40. Because in the New Testament, before Jesus started his public ministry, he went out into the desert, into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights to be tempted by the devil. And sometimes we talk about the difficult seasons in our lives as our times in the wilderness. Most of the time, a time in the wilderness means times where it's a struggle to survive or has been a struggle to survive. Or maybe it means a time in our lives where we've asked something like, what is my purpose here on earth? Or where is God in all of this? And social psychologists refer to these times as liminal space. And what liminal space is, it means that you're in between one time and place and another time and place. And it's often an unsettling place where you've left something behind, but you're not sure what you're trying to find, what you're going into. It is a place of wandering, it is a place of wondering, and it is a place, unfortunately, of waiting. And we don't like to wait, do we? There are a bunch of ways that we can find ourselves out in the wilderness in this liminal space. Sometimes unforeseen circumstances or emergencies are what drive us into the wilderness. Sometimes we willingly flee there, or maybe we even stumble there. Sometimes we can venture there to deliberately look for answers. Because think about this, in a lot of traditional cultures, young men, and sometimes young men and women, are required to go out into the wilderness as a rite of passage into adulthood. And they are expected to survive out in that wilderness so that they can find their truth, so that when they come back to that community, they can come back to it as adults with all the adult responsibilities that go along with it. But I know a lot of young people who in our day and age do rites of passage because we don't think about it. We don't have that many rites of passage in our own culture today. In fact, a lot of people say part of our problem is that we don't have many rites of passage from childhood into adulthood. But think of how many kids go out on a hike on the Pacific Crest Trail or the Appalachian Trail. Think about how many kids go into the Peace Corps or go overseas to do something to kind of find themselves during these, again, subliminal times when they're in between childhood and adulthood. In the case of the people of Israel, in our scripture this morning, they escaped the wilderness with God's help. They were fleeing from slavery and oppression on the hopes of a new homeland that was promised to their ancestors. Now, I've been thinking about the fires here on the West Coast this year. Those fires this year have destroyed communities like Berry Creek, just not far from where we live. In Oregon, they've destroyed the communities of Phoenix and Talent. And this on top of the devastating campfires that happened in 2018, displacing some of the same people. There are people who moved from where the campfire was over to Berry Creek and have lost their homes again. It reminds me that a lot of folks find themselves in the wilderness unwillingly. These folks did not venture out in hope. They weren't fleeing from some terrible past. In fact, for a lot of these folks, the past was comfortable. The past was secure. They had no desire to leave. But the fires changed everything. The old life is gone and can never be recovered. Maybe there's brighter days ahead, but for a lot of folks, they can't imagine those days. There were definitely people among the Israelites wandering out in the wilderness who could only see the bare, inhospitable wilderness, the desert. And as strange as it sounds, the only thing that they can call to mind when they're out in the desert, the only reality they can think of is what was in their past, which was being in slavery in Egypt. In fact, it started looking a whole lot better than the circumstance that they were in while they were in the desert. Because at least at the end of the day, the Egyptian slave drivers made sure that they had food. But there is no going back. And that is the reality of these liminal experiences that we have. We cannot break away from our connection with what we left behind. The young adult cannot return to being a child. People who grieve cannot resurrect their loved ones. The community cannot return to the innocence that it enjoyed before the disaster that shattered their reality. If there is a way out of the wilderness, if there is a way to pass through to the other side, the only way that we can go is forward and not backwards. So even though we might want to go back to what we had, even though we may even entertain fantasies that we can, the real question is, how do we survive in the wilderness now until we find a way to break through to that other side? The wilderness, by definition, seems harsh and inhospitable. It feels unsafe, it feels barren, and it feels devoid of all the necessities of life. And to make matters worse, we sometimes find ourselves at odds with those who are on the same journey during the early stages of our wilderness experience. Think about how we are responding to the pandemic now, right? Because you got some people who want to reject the idea of wearing a mask for whatever reason, for a variety of reasons. And at the same time, you've got some people who think that it's the only way to get back to normal. And no matter on which side of the issue we are upset and disgusted with the powers that be even more than the virus itself. Some of the Israelites in the Sinai desert started to grumble against Moses and Aaron, the people who got them out of there in the first place. In fact, they went as far as to blame Moses and Aaron for the situation that they were in. But there were also others who were ready to push forward right away. And here's the thing, nobody was necessarily right or wrong. They were just dealing with their wilderness experience differently. Now, this is true in any wilderness experience where two or more are gathered, right? The reality is that the person sitting next to you probably sees our present situation very differently from you. Some think we're moving too fast. Some people think we're moving too slow. Some think they can already see the promised land. But the thing is, there are others who think that they can see the promised land too, but they're not looking in the same direction. This can happen even when you are in your own personal wilderness. Because one part of you is going this way, and the other part of you is going that way. Different feelings and perspectives come into conflict, even within you. Even if I want to try to flee my own personal wilderness, I can't even achieve a consensus within myself about which way to go. So, the question we have on the table this morning is, how does one survive the wilderness, and where is God in that wilderness experience? Here's the paradox, though. God is often most clearly and strongly with us in our wilderness experiences. But it's usually only later, when we have broken through to the other side, that we can look back and see that, right? The liminal experience of being in the realm of in-between is actually one that breaks down our defenses and makes us more open to God. We just can't always see it when we're in the middle of it all. So let's see if we can learn something from the children of Israel here. Let's see if we can find some clues how to survive on our own wilderness experience by looking at the children of Israel's wilderness experience. Now, as harsh as their experience in slavery had been, they tended to associate the presence of God with the wealth and power of Egypt. You know, when the king's on the throne and everything is carefully ordered and under control, we imagine we're seeing the blessings of God. Oh, this is great. Not every day, we're slaves, of course, and the labor's terrible, but, things are good. We're being fed. Things are pretty. Man, this is a great fertile valley to live in. That's the way people are thinking. But is that healthy? If the king is in control, that must mean God is in control. And yet this Exodus story calls us to recognize that God is the one who can and will overthrow earthly kingdoms. But it's also God who will feed us even in the wilderness. The wilderness cannot destroy us because God is there with us in the wilderness. The wilderness place isn't where we're going to starve because God is there and God will provide. The wilderness place may well deprive us of the things that we thought we needed to survive, but God is there and will provide us with what we really need. God will reform us. God will reshape us in the wilderness. God will prepare us for a new life that lies ahead of us. To the people who thought they were about to starve in the wilderness, what did God do? God provided quail in the morning and manna bread in the evening. It was the other way around. They provided quail at night, and in the morning there was manna bread. And it sure wasn't what they expected. In fact, the word manna in Hebrew comes from the Hebrew word that means, what's this? So the bread God provided from heaven was not anything that they even recognized or anticipated, but it was what they needed. And it was God's gracious gift in their time of need. And this bread taught them the new lesson about surviving in the wilderness. It taught them that they could not prosper by hoarding. They couldn't, because if they collected more than their day's worth of manna, it went bad. It spoiled. It went rotten. Sort of reminiscent of Jesus' prayer to give us this day our daily bread. And wealth is kind of like that. It's unstable if you hoard it. It's like blood or water. It's got to keep moving and flowing to stay healthy. But if it banks up in one spot, doesn't go anywhere, it gets stagnant and it poisons us. So in the wilderness, we learn to rely on God one day at a time and to make sure that everyone is receiving their share. Here at this table that we share every week, this communion, we receive the bread of Christ. The early Christians frequently drew on the image of the Passover meal and the manna from heaven when they described communion. Now we may look at this and say, what is this? Oh, it's a hoagie roll in a sandwich bag. No, it's not. What is this? What is this that we have in front of us? What is this? We may not recognize it as anything that can sustain us out in the wilderness, but here it is. Here's the bread. Here's the cup. And a body gathered around the table, albeit virtually. And here's God meeting us and offering God's self to us as the bread of heaven to sustain us during our wilderness times. Whatever your wilderness is, whatever it is, whatever your response to the wilderness is, God is there with you. God is here. God knows your need. God will be with you. God will feed you and see you through. You won't be the same when you emerge, I'll tell you that. We're all changed in the wilderness. But if we will feed on the gifts of God and respond to the call of God, we will be changed for the better. Why? Because God is God, and the wilderness is God's home. Blessed be God forever.